The stagecoach wheel shattered against the rocky Montana trail with a sound like thunder, sending 30-year-old Lily Morgan tumbling across the wooden bench as the vehicle lurched to a violent halt. Dust clouds billowed through the canvas curtains while her fellow passengers, an elderly prospector and his wife bound for the copper mines, groaned and collected their scattered belongings. Through the settling grit, Lily glimpsed the Beartooth Mountains rising like ancient sentinels against the pewter sky, their peaks shrouded in storm clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The driver's gruff voice carried over the wind as he examined the damaged wheel, his curses painting the air blue while the horses stamped nervously in their traces. Lily smoothed her travel-worn burgundy dress and checked the small leather satchel clutched against her chest, feeling for the brass key sewn into its lining. 3 weeks of running had brought her to this desolate stretch of Montana territory, and Thomas Whitfield's men couldn't be more than a day behind her trail. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, spoken on his deathbed 6 months ago in their Seattle mansion. The money, Lily, hidden in the merchant's bank vault, box number 47. Thomas has been stealing from the railroad fund for years. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. Samuel Morgan had pressed the key into her palm with hands that trembled from the poison slowly killing him, though the doctor had called it consumption to spare the family scandal. Now, stranded in the middle of nowhere with storm clouds gathering overhead and her pursuers drawing closer, Lily wondered if she would live long enough to honor her father's dying wish. The prospector's wife was weeping softly, while her husband argued with the driver about repairs, their voices rising with each passing minute. 20 miles from Copper Ridge, with darkness approaching and no spare wheel to be found, their situation grew more desperate by the hour. That's when she heard the hoofbeats approaching from the east, measured and steady against the hard-packed earth. Lily's hand instinctively moved to the small derringer, hidden in her skirt pocket, a gift from her father who had insisted she learn to protect herself despite her sheltered upbringing. Through the dust-caked window, she watched a lone rider emerge from the afternoon haze, sitting his buckskin horse with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle. Jack Thompson had been checking his northern fence line when he spotted the disabled stagecoach in the distance, black smoke rising from the driver's attempt to signal for help. At 35, he'd spent enough years in Montana territory to recognize trouble when he saw it, and travelers stranded on the broken wheel trail rarely survived the night if storms rolled in from the mountains. His cattle ranch sprawled across Pine Valley below, but duty demanded he investigate before returning home to his empty house. The woman who stepped down from the coach caught his attention immediately. Auburn hair escaped from her traveling bonnet in wind-tossed curls, framing a face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a wariness that spoke of recent trauma. Her green eyes held intelligence and desperation in equal measure as they assessed him with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to trust no stranger without cause. "You folks need assistance," Jack observed, dismounting near the broken wheel. His voice carried the low, steady cadence of a man comfortable with silence, each word chosen with deliberate care. The driver straightened from his examination of the damage, relief evident in his weathered features as he recognized help had arrived. "Wheels cracked clean through, mister. Won't hold weight for another mile, let alone 20 to Copper Ridge." The old prospector stepped forward, his wife clutching his arm as she studied the gathering storm clouds with obvious anxiety. "We've got supplies and a little money if you can help us reach town." Jack's attention remained fixed on the auburn-haired woman who stood apart from the group, her posture radiating tension despite her attempts to appear calm. Something in her bearing suggested refinement, the kind of careful deportment that came from expensive finishing schools rather than frontier necessity. Yet her hands bore calluses that hadn't been there a month ago, and her traveling dress showed signs of hard use and hasty repairs. "Storm's coming fast," he said, nodding toward the darkening sky. "My ranch is closer than town, and I've got space for travelers. You're welcome to shelter there until morning, then I can arrange transport to Copper Ridge with a proper wagon." The offer was made to the group, but his eyes remained on the woman who seemed to be weighing options with the intensity of someone whose life depended on making the right choice. Lily studied the rancher's face, searching for signs of deception or hidden motive. Thomas Whitfield's men had taught her to trust no one, but something in Jack Thompson's weathered features suggested honesty. His hands rested easy on his horse's reins, calloused from honest work rather than violence, and his blue eyes held none of the calculating coldness she'd learned to fear in powerful men. "How do we know you're not working for them?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. The prospector and his wife exchanged confused glances, but Jack's expression didn't change as he studied her face with growing understanding. "Ma'am, I don't know who them might be, but I give you my word as a Christian man that my only interest is keeping folks safe from the storm." He gestured toward the approaching wall of dark clouds that now obscured the mountain peaks entirely. "You're free to stay with the coach if you prefer, but those canvas sides won't do much good against what's coming." The first fat raindrops struck Lily's face as she made her decision, trusting instinct over caution for perhaps the first time in her sheltered life. If this rancher meant her harm, she would face it with dignity rather than die slowly from exposure in a broken stagecoach. She gathered her skirts and stepped toward his horse, accepting the strong hand he offered to help her mount behind him. The prospector and his wife followed suit after a brief consultation, the old man's practical nature overriding his wife's nervous protests about accepting charity from strangers. Within minutes, they were riding through the first drops of what would become a torrential downpour, Jack's steady voice providing directions and reassurance as they made their way toward the distant lights of his ranch house. Lily clung to the rancher's broad shoulders as they rode, acutely aware of their physical closeness despite the circumstances. At 30, she'd never been this near to a man outside her family, her father's overprotective nature having shielded her from most social interactions throughout her youth. The boarding school he'd chosen specialized in academic excellence rather than social graces, producing brilliant but socially isolated young women who emerged unprepared for the complexities of adult relationships. Even her brief engagement to Marcus Hawthorne, the banker's son her father had approved, had involved nothing more intimate than chaperoned walks and carefully supervised conversations. When Marcus had attempted to steal a kiss during their final meeting, Lily's panic had been so evident that he'd immediately apologized and stepped away, leaving her feeling both relieved and oddly disappointed. Now pressed against Jack Thompson's rain-soaked shirt with his strong arms steady around her as he guided the horse through the storm, Lily found herself experiencing sensations she'd only read about in the first. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Forbidden novels hidden in her boarding school dormitory. The warmth of his body against her back, the scent of leather and pine soap that seemed to surround him, the gentle strength in his hands as he controlled their mount through increasingly difficult terrain. The ranch house emerged from the storm like a beacon, warm light glowing from its windows while smoke curled from the stone chimney. Jack guided them to the covered porch where they could dismount without getting completely soaked, though all four travelers were thoroughly wet despite his best efforts. Inside, the house revealed itself as the home of a man who valued comfort over luxury, with well-made furniture and a stone fireplace that dominated the main room. "You folks can warm yourselves by the fire while I tend to the horses," Jack instructed, hanging his hat on a peg near the door. "There's hot coffee in the pot and blankets in the chest if you need them. Mrs. Miller, there's a bedroom upstairs where you and your husband can rest once you're dry." He turned to Lily with careful politeness. "Ma'am, you're welcome to the spare room, or there's a settee by the fire if you'd prefer to stay where it's warmest." As Jack disappeared into the storm to stable their horses, Lily found herself studying his home with growing curiosity. Books filled shelves along one wall, their titles revealing interests in history, agriculture, and literature that spoke of an educated mind. A photograph on the mantelpiece showed a younger Jack standing beside a beautiful dark-haired woman in a wedding dress, both of them smiling with the joy of new love. The prospector's wife noticed her attention to the photograph and leaned closer. "Poor man lost his wife 4 years back," she whispered confidentially. "Childbirth took both her and the baby. Hasn't looked at another woman since, from what folks in town say. Lives alone out here, working his cattle and helping travelers like it might make up for what he lost." Lily felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for their host, recognizing in his careful kindness the behavior of someone who understood loss intimately. Her own father's death had left her feeling adrift in a world that suddenly seemed full of threats and deceptions, but at least she'd had 30 years of his protection and guidance. Jack Thompson had lost his wife and child in their prime, leaving him to face an empty house and uncertain future alone. When he returned from the stable, rain dripping from his coat and hat, Lily was standing by the fire with a cup of coffee warming her hands. The prospector and his wife had retreated upstairs to rest, leaving her alone with the rancher, who had shown such unexpected kindness to strangers. She watched him move about his kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple supper from supplies that suggested he rarely cooked for company. "Can I help?" she offered, setting down her cup and moving toward the stove where he was slicing bacon. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can follow instructions." Her admission brought a slight smile to his weathered features as he handed her a knife and indicated a bowl of potatoes waiting to be peeled. "Most city ladies wouldn't know one end of a potato from the other," he observed mildly, watching as she began the task with careful precision. "You handle that knife like you've done kitchen work before." His tone held no judgment, merely curiosity about the contradiction between her refined appearance and practical skills. Lily felt heat rise in her cheeks as she continued peeling potatoes with steady strokes. "My father believed in practical education along with academic subjects. He said a woman should be able to take care of herself no matter what circumstances life might bring." Her voice caught slightly on the memory. "I never imagined those circumstances would include fleeing across 3 territories with dangerous men hunting me like an animal." Jack's hand stilled on the bacon as he turned to study her profile in the firelight. The fear in her voice was real, as was the exhaustion that seemed to weigh on her shoulders like a physical burden. Whatever had brought her to Montana Territory, it wasn't pleasure travel or family visiting. "Those men you mentioned earlier," he said quietly, laying strips of bacon in the hot skillet where they began to sizzle and pop. "They the reason you're running." It wasn't really a question, more an invitation for her to share whatever burden she carried if she felt inclined to trust him with it. Lily's hands trembled slightly as she dropped another peeled potato into the bowl, memories of Seattle flooding back despite her efforts to focus on the present moment. Thomas Whitfield's cold smile, the sound of her father gasping for breath in his final hours, the locked doors and whispered threats that had finally convinced her to flee rather than fight. "They killed my father," she said simply, the words falling into the quiet kitchen like stones into still water. "Made it look like consumption, but I know better. He discovered something that could destroy a very powerful man, and that man decided silence was worth more than mercy." Her voice hardened with remembered pain. "Now they want me dead too, because I have proof of what he did." Jack turned from the stove to face her fully, his expression serious as he absorbed the implications of her confession. Running from killers across half the country was no small matter, especially for a woman traveling alone with limited resources and no experience of frontier survival. "This proof you carry," he asked carefully, "is it something that needs to reach the authorities? Because if it is, I know folks in Copper Ridge who can't be bought or intimidated. Judge Morrison's been cleaning up corruption in the territory courts, and Marshall Davis answers to Denver rather than local politicians." Lily met his steady gaze, seeing neither disbelief nor calculation in his blue eyes, only honest concern for her safety and a desire to help her find justice. For the first time since fleeing Seattle, she felt the possibility that someone might actually listen to her story and take action rather than dismiss her as a hysterical woman or turn her over to Whitfield's gold. "It's evidence of embezzlement from the railroad construction fund," she explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen over 5 years. Money that was supposed to build rail lines connecting mining towns to market cities. Instead, Thomas Whitfield used it to buy political influence and expand his shipping empire, while communities stayed isolated and miners died in unsafe conditions." The bacon forgotten, Jack listened with growing anger as she detailed the scope of Whitfield's crimes and the systematic way he'd eliminated anyone who threatened his carefully constructed network of corruption. By the time she finished her account, the kitchen had filled with the scent of burning meat and the sound of rain hammering against the windows. "We should eat," Jack said finally, turning back to salvage their supper while processing everything she'd told him. "Tomorrow we'll figure out how to get you safely to the territorial capital where that evidence can do some good. Tonight you're safe here, and that's what matters most." As they shared the simple meal with the prospector and his wife, who had emerged from their rest looking somewhat refreshed, Lily found herself studying Jack Thompson's face in the lamplight. His offer of help came without conditions or expectations, the natural response of a decent man confronted with injustice. Yet she sensed depths beneath his calm exterior, complexities forged by loss and hardship that had shaped him into someone who understood both strength and gentleness. The storm raged through the night, rattling windows and sending rain down the chimney in occasional bursts that hissed against the burning logs. Lily lay in the spare bedroom Jack had offered, listening to the wind howl around the sturdy ranch house, while her mind raced with possibilities and fears. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in weeks, she felt genuinely safe. Part 1. The opening crisis. Dawn broke gray and sullen over Pine Valley, the storm having passed during the night but leaving behind a landscape transformed by mud and standing water. Lily woke to the sound of voices in the kitchen below, Jack's low rumble mixing with the higher tones of the prospector's wife, as they discussed travel conditions and the state of the roads to Copper Ridge. Through her bedroom window, she could see cattle moving across distant pastures while Jack's hired hands went about their morning chores with the easy efficiency of men long accustomed to ranch work. She dressed quickly in her only remaining clean outfit, a simple blue traveling dress that had seen better days but still maintained some semblance of respectability. Her hair, freed from its usual tight arrangement during the night, fell in auburn waves past her shoulders, and she spent several minutes attempting to tame it into something approaching propriety. The small mirror above the washstand reflected a face marked by exhaustion and stress, but also something new, a determination that hadn't been there when she'd fled Seattle 3 weeks ago. Downstairs she found Jack preparing breakfast while the prospector studied a hand-drawn map spread across the kitchen table. The older man looked up as she entered, his weathered face creased with concern as he traced possible routes with his finger. "Roads are going to be difficult today," he announced, shaking his head at the various options. "Could take us 12 hours to reach Copper Ridge in good conditions, maybe twice that with all this mud." His wife nodded agreement from her position by the stove, where she was helping Jack tend to bacon and eggs with the comfortable cooperation of people who'd found their rhythm despite being strangers. Jack glanced up from the coffee pot, his blue eyes meeting Lily's with an expression of quiet concern. "Been thinking about your situation through the night," he said without preamble. "If those men are as close as you believe, taking the main road might not be the safest choice. There's another way, longer but less traveled, that might give us better options." Lily poured herself coffee from the pot he indicated, grateful for the warmth and the caffeine that might help clear her mind. "Us," she repeated, noting his word choice. "You're planning to escort us personally rather than simply arranging transport." The prospector's wife looked between them with growing understanding, her maternal instincts clearly engaged by the undercurrents of tension and attraction she sensed developing. "Can't say I'd feel safe traveling with just old Frank here," she admitted, patting her husband's shoulder affectionately. "Having a strong young man along would ease my mind considerable, especially with all this talk of dangerous fellows pursuing Miss Morgan." Jack's expression remained carefully neutral as he served breakfast, but Lily caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested internal conflict. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to making decisions based solely on his own needs and desires. Taking responsibility for 3 strangers, particularly one carrying the kind of trouble that followed Lily, represented a significant departure from his carefully ordered existence. "I appreciate the offer," Lily began carefully, not wanting to pressure him into something he might regret. "But I can't ask you to risk yourself for my problems. You've already done more than enough by providing shelter and safety for the needy." Jack set his plate on the table and met her gaze directly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Ma'am, I've been living alone for 4 years now, and I've learned that sometimes helping others is the only way a man can help himself. Your problems became mine the moment I decided to bring you here, and I don't abandon obligations lightly." The simple statement, delivered without drama or expectation of gratitude, affected Lily more deeply than flowery declarations might have. Here was a man who understood duty and honor not as abstract concepts but as practical guidelines for daily living. His offer came not from romantic interest or hope of reward, but from fundamental decency that demanded he see difficult situations through to their conclusion. As they ate breakfast, Jack outlined his proposed route to the territorial capital, a journey that would take them through less settled country where Whitfield's men would have fewer resources and informants. The prospector and his wife would part ways at Copper Ridge, continuing north to the mining camps while Jack escorted Lily southeast toward Helena and the territorial courts. The plan made sense from a practical standpoint, but Lily found herself struggling with emotions she'd never experienced before. The prospect of spending several days alone with Jack Thompson filled her with equal measures of anticipation and terror. Not because she feared he would harm her, but because she feared her own inexplicable attraction to this quiet, competent man who seemed so different from anyone she'd known in her sheltered life. At 30, she'd never traveled alone with a man, never experienced the kind of casual intimacy that would inevitably develop during long hours of riding and camping under the stars. Her father's protective influence had extended to every aspect of her social development, ensuring she remained pure and innocent for whatever husband he might eventually approve. Now faced with circumstances that demanded she trust Jack Thompson with her life, Lily realized how unprepared she was for the complex emotions beginning to stir within her. They were loading supplies into Jack's wagon when the sound of approaching hoofbeats caused him to stiffen and reach instinctively for the rifle mounted beside the driver's seat. 3 riders were approaching from the main road, their pace unhurried but purposeful as they made their way toward the ranch house through the morning mist. Lily's blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead rider, a tall man with pale eyes and a carefully trimmed beard, who sat his horse with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and gold. Frank Miller, Thomas Whitfield's chief enforcer and the man who had personally delivered the threats that finally convinced her to flee Seattle. Behind Miller rode 2 other men she recognized from the docks and gambling halls where Whitfield conducted his shadow business. Red Canyon, a half-breed tracker, whose reputation for violence preceded him throughout the Northwest Territories. And Carl Mason, a former Pinkerton detective who'd been dismissed for excessive brutality but found new employment with men who valued results over methods. Jack's hand tightened on his rifle as he assessed the approaching riders, his experienced eyes noting their weapons and the way they spread out to cover multiple angles of approach. These weren't casual visitors or lost travelers seeking directions. These were predators, and they'd come hunting. "Those your men?" he asked Lily quietly, never taking his eyes off the riders who had now stopped just outside comfortable rifle range. His voice carried no accusation or regret, merely calm assessment of a changed situation that would require different tactics than originally planned. Lily nodded, unable to speak past the fear that had suddenly constricted her throat. After weeks of running and hiding, Whitfield's hunters had finally cornered her, and now Jack Thompson would pay the price for his kindness to a stranger. She watched Miller raise his hand in mock greeting, his cold smile visible even at this distance as he prepared to deliver whatever ultimatum he'd traveled so far to present. The moment of crisis had arrived, and Lily Morgan realized that all her planning and preparation had led to this single point where everything would either resolve in her favor or end in violence that would destroy not just her own life, but the lives of innocent people who had shown her nothing but compassion and generosity. Part 2. The catalyst encounter. Frank Miller dismounted with the deliberate slowness of a man who enjoyed making others wait, his pale eyes never leaving Jack's face as he approached the ranch house. His companions remained mounted, hands resting casually near their weapons while they studied the defensive positions available around the property. The morning sun glinted off Miller's silver spurs and the pearl handle of the Colt revolver worn low on his hip, markers of a man who took pride in his reputation for violence. "Good morning," Miller called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone educated back east before choosing a different path in life. "Fine spread you have here, Mr. Thompson. Word in Copper Ridge is you run honest cattle and treat travelers fairly." His gaze shifted to Lily, who stood frozen beside the wagon with her hand pressed against the satchel containing her father's key. "Been looking for a particular traveler myself. Young lady with auburn hair, traveling alone, might have mentioned troubles back in Seattle."
Jack stepped between Miller and Lily with casual movement that appeared natural while positioning himself as a barrier between the gunman and his target. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description," he replied evenly, his tone holding neither fear nor aggression. "Most folks passing through are miners or ranchers, not city ladies traveling solo." The lie rolled off Jack's tongue with surprising ease, though Lily could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his right hand remained close to his rifle. She watched Miller's cold smile widen as he studied Jack's face, clearly enjoying the game of cat and mouse that had developed around her presence. Red Canyon leaned forward in his saddle, his dark eyes scanning the ranch buildings with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to planning attacks. Half-breed Tracker had learned his skills hunting Apache in Arizona before discovering that private employers paid better than the army for finding people who didn't want to be found. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and traditional beadwork decorated his leather vest in patterns that spoke of tribal heritage mixed with frontier pragmatism. "Tracks tell different story," Red Canyon observed, his voice carrying the flat intonation of someone who spoke English as a second language. "Woman's boot prints in mud near stable. Small feet, narrow heels. Same size as prints we followed from Broken Wheel Trail." His gaze fixed on Lily with predatory intensity. "She here, but trying to hide behind cowboys' lies." Miller nodded approvingly at his tracker's assessment while Carl Mason shifted position to cover the rear of the house, clearly anticipating the possibility that their quarry might attempt to escape through back doors or windows. Mason's movements betrayed his Pinkerton training, efficient and methodical as he eliminated potential escape routes with professional competence. "Now, Mr. Thompson," Miller continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the obvious threat in his words, "I'm hoping we can resolve this situation without unpleasantness. Miss Morgan there is wanted for questioning regarding her father's business dealings. Nothing more serious than that, I assure you. We're prepared to compensate you generously for your cooperation in this matter." Jack's expression hardened as he absorbed the implications of Miller's offer, recognizing the veiled threat beneath the polite language. Men who tracked women across 3 territories didn't limit themselves to questioning, and the weapons they carried suggested they were prepared for resistance. "Miss Morgan is under my protection," Jack stated flatly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to having his words respected. "Any business you have with her can be conducted through proper legal channels in Copper Ridge. Judge Morrison handles territorial matters fairly and according
To law. Miller's laugh held no warmth. As he glanced at his companions, clearly amused by Jack's suggestion that legal procedures might apply to their current situation. Thomas Whitfield's reach extended far beyond Montana territory, and Judge Morrison's reputation for honesty made him useful for handling routine matters, while more serious business was conducted through different channels. "I'm afraid legal channels move too slowly for our purposes," Miller explained, his hand dropping to rest on his gun butt with casual menace. "Mr. Whitfield has pressing business matters that require Miss Morgan's immediate attention. Time is quite valuable in these situations, and delays can be costly for everyone involved." The prospector and his wife had retreated to the porch during this exchange, clearly recognizing the dangerous undercurrents flowing between the two groups of men. Frank Miller's weathered face showed the worry of someone who'd seen range wars develop from smaller disagreements, while his wife clutched his arm and whispered urgent suggestions about seeking shelter inside the house. Lily found her voice despite the fear that had nearly paralyzed her since Miller's arrival, stepping forward to address the gunman directly rather than allowing Jack to bear the full burden of confrontation. "Miller," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "my father's business dealings died with him 6 months ago. I have no information that would interest Mr. Whitfield or anyone else regarding commercial matters." Miller's cold smile widened as he studied her face, clearly pleased to have drawn her into direct conversation where he could better assess her truthfulness and emotional state. Years of working for Thomas Whitfield had taught him to read people's weaknesses and exploit them for maximum advantage. "Miss Morgan, your modesty does you credit, but we both know that's not entirely accurate," he replied smoothly. "Your father was quite thorough in his record keeping, and certain documents have come to light that suggest you might possess information valuable to resolving outstanding questions about railroad funding and construction contracts. The mention of railroad contracts sent ice through Lily's veins, confirming her worst fears about how much Whitfield knew regarding her father's discoveries and the evidence she carried. Samuel Morgan had been careful to conduct his investigation secretly, but Thomas Whitfield's network of informants and purchased loyalty extended throughout Seattle's business community. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lily insisted, though she could hear the tremor in her voice that betrayed her nervousness. "My father handled his business affairs privately, and I was never involved in commercial decisions or record keeping." Red Canyon spoke again from his mounted position, his tracker's instincts focused on practical matters rather than verbal sparring. "Weather changing. More storms coming from mountains. If we take woman now, can reach railroad by tomorrow night. Wait longer, trails get worse, travel gets dangerous." Miller nodded acknowledgement of his tracker's assessment while maintaining his focus on Jack's reaction to the increasing pressure. The rancher's face had hardened into lines of stubborn determination that suggested he wouldn't surrender Lily without significant persuasion. But 3 armed men held considerable advantages over 1 cowboy with a rifle. "Mr. Thompson," Miller continued, his tone growing more businesslike as negotiations approached their crucial phase. "You seem like a reasonable man who understands that some situations require practical solutions rather than idealistic gestures. Miss Morgan's cooperation would be appreciated, but it's not actually necessary for our purposes. We're prepared to take her with or without her consent, though obviously everyone's comfort would be better served by voluntary compliance." Jack's response was immediate and uncompromising, his rifle coming up to rest across his arms in a position that could quickly become threatening if circumstances required. "Anyone who wants to take Miss Morgan will have to go through me first, and I guarantee that won't be as easy as you might expect. This is my land, these are my guests, and I protect what's mine." The simple declaration, delivered without bluster or theatrical posturing, carried more weight than lengthy speeches might have achieved. Miller's expression showed grudging respect for Jack's position while his companions shifted slightly in their saddles, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond simple intimidation into potential violence. Carl Mason spoke for the first time since their arrival, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone who'd handled similar confrontations during his Pinkerton career. "Thompson's got good defensive position here. Cover from the house and outbuildings, high ground advantage. We take casualties trying to root him out by force, especially if he's got help from hired hands." Miller considered this assessment while studying the ranch layout with fresh eyes, noting the strategic advantages that favored defenders over attackers in any direct confrontation. Thomas Whitfield paid well for results, but he didn't appreciate expensive failures that drew unwanted attention from territorial authorities. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter more privately," Miller suggested, his tone becoming almost reasonable as he recognized the need for different tactics. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your position regarding hospitality and protection of guests. Those are admirable qualities in a man. However, Miss Morgan's situation involves complexities that extend far beyond your ranch boundaries." Jack's grip on his rifle remained steady as he evaluated Miller's apparent willingness to negotiate, though his expression suggested deep skepticism regarding any proposals the gunman might offer. Years of dealing with cattle rustlers and claim jumpers had taught him to recognize when predators were simply shifting tactics rather than abandoning their objectives. "Say what you came to say," Jack replied curtly, his voice making clear that lengthy negotiations weren't welcome. "Miss Morgan stays here under my protection until she chooses to leave of her own free will. That's not negotiable regardless of what complications you think might be involved." Miller's smile took on a different quality as he reached inside his coat, causing both Jack and Lily to tense in anticipation of violence. Instead of a weapon, however, he produced a folded document sealed with official-looking wax and ribbons that suggested legal authority. "Territorial warrant for Miss Morgan's arrest," Miller explained, holding the document high enough for them to see the impressive seals and signatures adorning its surface. "Issued by Judge Harrison in Seattle on charges of embezzlement and theft of government property. As duly appointed agents of the court, were authorized to apprehend the suspect and return her to Washington Territory for trial. Lily's heart sank as she recognized the effectiveness of Whitfield's latest strategy, using purchased legal authority to legitimize kidnapping and murder under color of law. Thomas Whitfield's political connections extended throughout the territorial court system, and Judge Harrison had been accepting his gold for years in exchange for favorable rulings on shipping contracts and mining claims. "Let me see that warrant," Jack demanded, extending his hand toward Miller while maintaining his defensive posture. "If it's legitimate, it should contain specific charges and evidence supporting the allegations against Miss Morgan." Miller's hesitation before handing over the document revealed its likely authenticity, though Jack's examination would certainly expose the rushed nature of its preparation and the vague language used to justify Lily's arrest. Thomas Whitfield's lawyers were skilled at creating legal documents that would withstand casual scrutiny while concealing their true purpose from more careful examination. As Jack studied the warrant's contents, Lily watched his expression change from skepticism to grim understanding. The charges listed were carefully crafted to sound serious while remaining vague enough to justify almost any actions taken in her apprehension and transport back to Seattle. "Charges are pretty general," Jack observed, his tone suggesting the document's inadequacies were obvious to anyone with legal knowledge. "Embezzlement of unspecified amounts, theft of government property that isn't described, conspiracy charges that don't name other alleged conspirators. Looks like someone was in a hurry to create legal justification without bothering with actual evidence." Miller's expression tightened at Jack's astute analysis of the warrant's weaknesses, though his hand remained near his weapon as he prepared to fall back on more direct methods if legal authority proved insufficient to accomplish his mission. "Evidence will be presented at trial," Miller replied stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with having his legal authority questioned by someone who understood court procedures better than expected. "Our job is apprehension and transport, not adjudication of guilt or innocence." Part 3. The stakes escalation. The standoff continued as storm clouds gathered once again over the Beartooth Mountains, creating an ominous backdrop for the confrontation developing around Lily's fate. Jack's hired hands had noticed the commotion and were drifting closer to the main house, ostensibly going about their morning chores but clearly positioning themselves to support their employer if trouble erupted. Miller counted at least 4 ranch hands within rifle range, all of them armed and loyal to Jack Thompson, according to information gathered in Copper Ridge. What had begun as a simple apprehension mission was developing into a potential siege that could attract unwanted attention from territorial authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions about warrants and jurisdiction. Red Canyon studied the changing tactical situation with growing unease, his tracker instincts warning him that conditions were shifting against their mission's success. Weather getting worse, more storms coming. Too many witnesses now, cowboys talking in town about strangers asking questions. Better to withdraw, find different approach. The half-breed's assessment carried weight with Miller, who recognized the wisdom of avoiding pitched battles when stealth and surprise offered better chances for success. Thomas Whitfield's instructions had emphasized the importance of discretion in handling Lily Morgan, though violence remained an acceptable option if other methods failed. Carl Mason offered a different perspective based on his law enforcement experience, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone accustomed to handling resistant subjects. "Could burn them out," he suggested quietly. "Fire spreads fast in dry conditions, forces everyone into the open where we control the situation. Rancher dies defending his property, woman dies trying to escape the flames. Accidents happen during apprehensions." The casual discussion of murder sent chills through Lily as she realized how completely Thomas Whitfield's men had embraced their employer's willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened his interests. These weren't reluctant enforcers following orders under duress, but professional killers who enjoyed their work and took pride in finding creative solutions to difficult problems. Jack's expression hardened further as he absorbed the implications of Mason's suggestion, recognizing that these men represented a level of threat he hadn't encountered since his Army scouting days. Range disputes and cattle rustling involved violence,
but rarely the calculated brutality that characterized Thomas Whitfield's business methods. "Any man who tries to burn my ranch will die before the first flame catches," Jack stated with quiet conviction, his rifle shifting to a more openly threatening position. "Miss Morgan is under my protection, and I've given my word that she'll stay safe. My word means something in this territory, and men who try to make me break it generally regret the attempt." Miller studied Jack's face with professional interest, recognizing the difference between bluster and genuine dangerous intent. Years of intimidating frightened businessmen and corrupt officials hadn't prepared him for confronting someone with military training and the moral conviction to back up his threats with lethal force. The prospector chose that moment to step forward from the porch, his weathered face showing the determination of someone who decided to take a stand despite obvious personal risk. "Mr. Miller," he announced in a voice that carried across the ranch yard, "my wife and I witnessed your conversation about burning folks out of their homes. That's not law enforcement, that's murder, and we'll testify to that effect in any court that asks." Frank Miller's wife nodded vigorous agreement with her husband's statement, her maternal instincts clearly engaged by the threat to Lily's safety. "We may be old, but we're not blind or deaf," she added with surprising steel in her voice. "Decent folks don't burn homes with people inside, regardless of what kind of papers they carry." The unexpected intervention by witnesses complicated Miller's tactical situation significantly. As Thomas Whitfield's political protection wouldn't extend to covering up the murder of respectable citizens who could testify about premeditated arson and assassination. Public opinion in mining territories ran strongly against claim jumpers and home burners, making such tactics politically dangerous even for powerful men. Miller's calculation of risks and benefits shifted as he recognized that his mission had attracted too much attention and too many witnesses for simple solutions to remain viable. Thomas Whitfield expected results, but he also expected discretion, and burning down ranch houses in broad daylight exceeded the boundaries of acceptable risk. "Perhaps we should reconsider our approach," Miller announced, his tone becoming more conciliatory as he adapted to changed circumstances. "Miss Morgan, surely you recognize that this situation can't continue indefinitely. Mr. Whitfield's patience has limits, and your continued flight only makes resolution more difficult for everyone involved." Lily found her voice again, despite the fear that had nearly overwhelmed her during the discussion of burning the ranch house. "Mr. Miller," she said, stepping closer to Jack's protective presence while addressing the gunman directly, "I have no intention of voluntarily placing myself in Mr. Whitfield's custody. My father's death taught me what happens to people who threaten his interests, and I have no desire to suffer the same fate." Miller's expression showed surprise at her direct acknowledgement of Thomas Whitfield's responsibility for Samuel Morgan's death, as most of his employer's victims maintain public fiction about natural causes or accidents, even while privately understanding the truth about their circumstances. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Morgan," Miller replied carefully, recognizing that her willingness to speak openly about murder suggested she possessed evidence to support such claims. "Whitfield has always conducted his business affairs within legal boundaries and would be quite disturbed to learn that anyone suspected him of criminal behavior." The hypocrisy of his statement would have been laughable under different circumstances, but Lily recognized it as part of the careful dance that allowed powerful men to commit crimes while maintaining public respectability. Thomas Whitfield's victims understood the rules of this game, keeping silent about their knowledge in exchange for continued survival, however precarious. "My father's business records contain detailed information about Mr. Whitfield's methods," Lily replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke the truth openly for the first time since fleeing Seattle. "Railroad construction funds, mining claim purchases, shipping contracts, political contributions, even the arrangements made for silencing inconvenient witnesses. Everything documented in his own careful handwriting." Miller's face went pale as he absorbed the implications of her statement, realizing that Samuel Morgan had been more thorough in his investigation than Thomas Whitfield had suspected. The existence of detailed records explaining the full scope of Whitfield's criminal empire represented an existential threat that justified extreme measures to prevent public disclosure. "Where are these records now?" Miller asked, his voice taking on new urgency as he recognized the magnitude of what Lily claimed to possess. Such documents would need to be examined to determine their accuracy and relevance to current business operations. "Safe beyond your reach," Lily replied, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely confident about the security of her father's evidence. "Hidden where Thomas Whitfield will never find them unless I choose to reveal their location voluntarily." Red Canyon had been studying Lily's body language during this exchange, his tracker instincts focused on reading the subtle signs that revealed truth from deception. "She lying about something," he observed quietly. "Records not far away, maybe close enough to take if we find right pressure points." The half-breed's assessment sent fresh fear through Lily as she realized how completely her inexperience with deception had betrayed her position to someone trained in reading human behavior. The key sewn into her satchel suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and her hand moved instinctively to protect the evidence that represented her only hope for justice. Miller noticed the defensive gesture and smiled coldly as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. "Miss Morgan," he said, his tone becoming almost gentle, "you're carrying something right now that you don't want us to find. Something small enough to conceal but important enough to risk your life protecting. Perhaps we should examine your belonging to ensure you're not transporting anything dangerous or illegal." Jack stepped forward to place himself more completely between Miller and Lily, his rifle now held in both hands and clearly ready for immediate use. "Nobody searches Miss Morgan or her property without proper legal authority, and that warrant you showed me doesn't authorize general seizure of personal belongings." The legal technicality was probably correct, but Miller's patience with procedural niceties had reached its limits as the morning wore on without achieving his mission objectives. Thomas Whitfield's instructions had been clear about the importance of recovering whatever evidence Samuel Morgan had gathered, and failure to complete this task would have serious consequences for everyone involved. "Mr. Thompson," Miller said, his voice hardening as negotiations approached their breaking point, "you're interfering with official law enforcement business, which makes you subject to arrest as an accessory to the crimes Miss Morgan has committed. Stand aside now, or face the consequences of obstructing justice." The threat was delivered with cold professionalism, but Jack's response was immediate and uncompromising. His rifle came up to his shoulder in one smooth motion, the barrel pointed directly at Miller's chest while his finger found the trigger. "One of you makes a move toward Miss Morgan, and you'll be the first to die," he stated flatly. "Test me if you think I'm bluffing." Part 4. The Sanctuary Establishment. The tension crackling between Jack's rifle and Miller's drawn gun might have erupted into immediate violence if not for the sudden rumble of thunder rolling across Pine Valley. The approaching storm provided a moment of distraction that allowed cooler heads to prevail as both sides recognized the tactical disadvantages of fighting in increasingly difficult weather conditions. Carl Mason was the first to recognize the changing dynamics, his Pinkerton training emphasizing the importance of tactical withdrawal when circumstances shifted against mission success. "Weather's getting worse fast," he observed, nodding toward the dark clouds that now obscured most of the mountain peaks. "Visibility dropping, roads turning to mud, communications cut off from town. Not good conditions for apprehending fugitives." Miller holstered his weapon with obvious reluctance, though his pale eyes never left Jack's face as he calculated odds and alternatives. The rancher's military bearing and steady rifle suggested combat experience that would make any direct confrontation costly, while the approaching storm complicated extraction routes back to the railroad. "This isn't over, Thompson," Miller announced, swinging back into his saddle with fluid grace that spoke of countless hours spent on horseback pursuing fugitives across difficult terrain. "Miss Morgan can't hide behind your hospitality forever, and Mr. Whitfield's resources are considerable when properly applied to solving problems. Red Canyon and Carl Mason mounted their horses without comment, though both men continued studying the ranch layout and defensive positions with professional interest. The half-breed tracker's eyes lingered on the stable and outbuildings, clearly memorizing details that might prove useful during future approaches to the property. "We'll be back when conditions are more favorable," Miller continued, his tone carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd never failed to complete a mission regardless of initial setbacks. Miss Morgan would be wise to consider her position carefully and reach reasonable accommodations before circumstances require more direct methods of resolution. With that ominous promise hanging in the air, the three riders turned their horses toward the main road and disappeared into the gathering storm, leaving behind a ranch yard that suddenly felt empty despite the presence of hired hands and guests. Jack maintained his defensive posture until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, then slowly lowered his rifle while scanning the horizon for any signs of continued surveillance. "They'll be back," he stated, matter-of-factly, turning toward Lily with an expression that mixed concern and determination in equal measure. "Probably tonight or tomorrow, depending on how badly they want whatever you're carrying and how much risk they're willing to accept to get it." Lily nodded numbly, the adrenaline that had sustained her during the confrontation now leaving her feeling drained and shaky. The temporary reprieve felt hollow when measured against Thomas Whitfield's demonstrated persistence in eliminating threats to his empire. And she couldn't expect Jack Thompson to risk his life indefinitely for a stranger's problems. "I should go," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the increasing wind that swept across the valley. "You've done more than enough already, and I won't be responsible for bringing more danger to your home. There must be other ways to reach the territorial capital without involving innocent people in my troubles." Jack's response was immediate and uncompromising, his tone making clear that discussion of her departure was premature at best. "Miss Morgan, those men aren't giving up just because they withdrew for the moment. They're regrouping and planning different approaches, which means you need protection more now than before. Running off alone would be suicide." The prospector and his wife approached hesitantly, their faces showing the strain of witnessing threatening behavior that had escalated far beyond normal frontier disagreements. Frank Miller's weathered features reflected deep worry as he addressed Jack directly about the implications of continued involvement in such dangerous circumstances. "Mr. Thompson," the older man said carefully, "my wife and I appreciate your hospitality more than we can express, but we're concerned about staying here if those fellows are planning to return. We're not fighting people, and we don't want to be caught in the middle of whatever trouble Miss Morgan has brought to your door." Jack nodded, understanding of their position, while gesturing toward the ranch house where warm lamplight glowed invitingly against the darkening sky. "The storm's going to be worse than yesterday's weather," he observed, studying the approaching clouds with experienced eyes. "Roads will be impassable until it passes, which gives us time to figure out better solutions for everyone involved." Inside the house, the atmosphere felt charged with tension despite the comfortable furnishings and crackling fire that welcomed them back to safety. Lily settled into a chair near the hearth while Jack moved about the room, checking window latches and positioning firearms where they would be easily accessible if needed. The prospector's wife busied herself preparing coffee and simple food from Jack's well-stocked kitchen, her maternal instincts clearly engaged by the crisis developing around them. She worked with practiced efficiency while stealing worried glances at Lily's pale face and trembling hands, recognizing signs of exhaustion and fear that spoke of weeks spent running from determined pursuers. "Miss Morgan," the older woman said gently, setting a steaming cup beside Lily's chair, "you look like you haven't had a proper meal or full night's sleep in weeks. Whatever troubles brought you here, you need to take care of yourself before you can solve anything else." Lily accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth while absorbing the simple kindness offered by strangers who owed her nothing but somehow felt compelled to help anyway. The contrast with Thomas Whitfield's cold calculation and Frank Miller's professional menace was so stark it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she managed, her voice catching slightly on the words. "I haven't experienced much kindness lately, and I'd almost forgotten how good it feels to be treated like a human being rather than a problem to be solved or eliminated." Jack settled into the chair across from her, his rifle within easy reach as he studied her face with growing concern. The confrontation with Miller had revealed new layers to her situation, and the mention of detailed business records suggested stakes that extended far beyond simple personal revenge or business disputes. "These records you mentioned," Jack said carefully, choosing his words to avoid pressuring her while gathering information necessary for planning their defense. "Are they the kind of evidence that could actually bring Whitfield to justice if they reached the right authorities? Because if they are, we need to think about getting them to people who can't be bought or intimidated." Lily hesitated, recognizing that full disclosure would deepen Jack's involvement in circumstances that had already nearly gotten him killed. Yet his steady gaze and obvious competence suggested he might actually be capable of helping her succeed where weeks of solitary flight had only led to increasingly desperate circumstances. "My father spent 2 years documenting Thomas Whitfield's crimes," she said finally, her voice gaining strength as she spoke the truth openly for the second time that day. "Railroad construction funds diverted to personal accounts, bribes paid to territorial officials, mining claims stolen through fraudulent legal proceedings. Even records of payments made to men like Frank Miller for eliminating inconvenient witnesses." Jack's expression hardened as he absorbed the implications of what she described. Recognizing that such comprehensive evidence would indeed represent an existential threat to someone with Thomas Whitfield's political ambitions and business interests. The scope of corruption she outlined explained both the determination of her pursuers and the extreme measures they
were willing to employ. "Where are these records now?" he asked, though his tone made clear he wouldn't pressure her to reveal locations or methods she preferred to keep private. Because if Whitfield's people get their hands on that evidence, a lot of innocent folks are going to continue suffering while he stays rich and powerful. "The key to my father's safety deposit box is sewn into the lining of my travel bag," Lily admitted, her hand moving instinctively to protect the satchel that had never left her side during 3 weeks of flight. "The records are in Seattle, locked away where only I can retrieve them, but they won't do any good if I'm dead or disappeared." Jack nodded slowly as pieces of the puzzle fell into place, understanding now why Thomas Whitfield's men had been so persistent in their pursuit despite the costs and risks involved in chasing her across multiple territories. Control of that key meant control of evidence that could destroy careers and send powerful men to prison, making Lily's capture worth almost any price. The storm struck with renewed fury as evening approached, rain hammering against the windows while wind howled around the sturdy ranch house. Inside, the 4 refugees from Thomas Whitfield's ambitions settled into an uneasy domesticity, sharing simple meals and carefully normal conversation while everyone remained acutely aware of the dangers gathering beyond their temporary sanctuary. Part 5. The initial trust. As night deepened around the ranch house, Jack made his rounds checking doors and windows while his guests settled into sleeping arrangements that reflected both practicality and propriety. The prospector and his wife retired to the upstairs bedroom they'd occupied the previous night, while Jack insisted that Lily take his own room while he maintained watch from the main living area. Lily protested the arrangement that displaced him from his own bed, but Jack's expression made clear that discussion was pointless when it came to matters of guest comfort and personal safety. The bedroom contained evidence of his married life that he'd never removed, photographs and personal items that spoke of happiness cut short by tragedy and loss. She studied the wedding portrait on his dresser, noting how much younger and more carefree Jack appeared standing beside his beautiful bride in their moment of joy and hope. The woman's face showed intelligence and warmth that suggested she'd been far more than merely decorative, and Lily found herself wondering what kind of partnership they'd shared before death intervened. A soft knock on the door interrupted her contemplation, and she opened it to find Jack holding a cup of chamomile tea and wearing an expression of careful concern. "Thought you might need something to help you sleep," he said quietly, offering the cup while maintaining respectful distance from the bedroom threshold. Lily accepted the tea gratefully, noting the thoughtfulness behind the gesture and the way he avoided any appearance of impropriety despite their unusual circumstances. Such consideration felt foreign after weeks of suspicious glances and hostile attention from strangers who saw her only as a problem or opportunity. "Jack," she said, using his given name for the first time since their acquaintance began, "I want you to know how much your protection means to me. Not just the physical safety, but the way you've treated me like someone worth defending rather than a burden to be endured." His expression softened at her words, though he maintained the careful distance that characterized all their interactions despite the growing familiarity between them. "Miss Morgan," he replied, his voice carrying quiet conviction, "everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what troubles they might be carrying. That's not kindness, it's basic human decency." The simple statement revealed depths to his character that went beyond mere frontier hospitality or masculine protectiveness. Jack Thompson operated from principles that guided his behavior regardless of personal cost or convenience, making him fundamentally different from the calculating opportunists who had dominated her recent experience. "Please," she said, setting down the tea to meet his gaze directly, "call me Lily. After everything we've been through together, I think we've moved beyond formal address, and I hope you know that my trust in you goes far deeper than simple gratitude for shelter and protection." The use of her given name seemed to affect him more deeply than she'd expected, causing him to pause in the doorway as if weighing the implications of increased intimacy between them. "Miss Lily," he said finally, his voice carrying new warmth, "I'm honored by your trust, and I promise you won't regret placing it with me." After he left to resume his vigil in the main room, Lily found herself unable to settle despite her exhaustion and the soothing effects of the chamomile tea. The events of the day had created new bonds between them that she'd never experienced with any man, a combination of shared danger and mutual respect that felt both thrilling and terrifying. At 30, she'd never been alone with a man overnight, never experienced the kind of casual intimacy that developed naturally between people facing crisis together. Her father's protective influence had extended to every aspect of her social development, ensuring she remained properly chaperoned and sheltered from the complexities of adult relationships. Even her engagement to Marcus Hawthorne had involved nothing more intimate than supervised conversations and carefully structured social interactions designed to allow courtship while preventing any behavior that might compromise her reputation. The banking heir had been chosen for his social standing and financial prospects rather than romantic compatibility, and their interactions had felt more like business negotiations than emotional connections. Now, lying in Jack Thompson's bed while he stood guard against men who wanted to kill her, Lily found herself experiencing emotions and physical sensations she'd only encountered in the romantic novels her boarding school had forbidden but never successfully confiscated from student dormitories. The scent of his cologne lingered on the pillows, masculine and clean with hints of leather and pine that seemed to embody everything she found compelling about this quiet, competent man who'd risked his life for a stranger's cause. Her body responded to his proximity in ways that would have shocked her sheltered upbringing, warmth spreading through her as she imagined what it might feel like to be held and cherished by someone so fundamentally decent. Through the bedroom door, she could hear Jack moving quietly about the main room, checking windows and adding logs to the fire with practiced efficiency that spoke of countless nights spent alone in this house. The sounds of his solitary routine emphasized the loneliness of his existence, the empty spaces left by his wife's death that he'd never attempted to fill. During her wakeful hours, Lily found herself listening for any sounds that might indicate his position or activities, drawn by curiosity about this man who'd become her protector, and increasingly, the focus of emotions she'd never expected to experience. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the solid walls of his home, she felt safer than she had since fleeing Seattle 3 weeks ago. When sleep finally claimed her near dawn, her dreams were filled with images of strong hands and gentle eyes, of a future that might be possible if they survived the dangers gathering around them like storm clouds over the Montana mountains. For the first time since her father's death, Lily Morgan allowed herself to hope that protection and safety might be only the beginning of what Jack Thompson could offer her. Part 6. The vulnerability moment. 3 days passed in tense quiet at the Thompson Ranch, with no sign of Miller's return despite everyone's expectation that Whitfield's men would reappear once the storm cleared. Jack maintained constant vigilance while going about his daily cattle work, never straying far from the house and keeping his rifle within reach during every task. His hired hands had been quietly informed of potential trouble, and they moved about their duties with heightened awareness that spoke of men accustomed to frontier dangers. Lily found herself settling into domestic routines that felt both foreign and strangely comforting after months of constant flight and uncertainty. She helped with cooking and cleaning despite Jack's protests that guests shouldn't work, needing physical activity to distract from the anxiety that gnawed at her during quiet moments. The simple tasks of kneading bread and tending the vegetable garden behind the house provided welcome relief from the mental burden of carrying evidence that could destroy Thomas Whitfield's empire. The prospector and his wife had departed on the second day when road conditions improved enough for careful travel, expressing gratitude for Jack's hospitality while making clear their desire to distance themselves from whatever troubles might follow Lily to his ranch. Their leaving created a new intimacy in the house, with only Lily and Jack sharing meals and evening conversations by the fire. On the third evening, as rain began falling again in gentle sheets that drummed softly against the windows, Lily found herself studying Jack's profile as he read a leather-bound volume of poetry near the hearth. The flickering lamplight emphasized the strong lines of his jaw and the silver threading through his dark hair, creating an image of masculine competence tempered by intelligence and sensitivity she'd never encountered in her sheltered experience. "What are you reading?" she asked, setting aside the mending she'd been working on while stealing glances at him throughout the evening. Her voice carried genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness, as she'd noticed his small library contained volumes that suggested education and literary appreciation unusual among frontier ranchers. Jack looked up from his book with slight embarrassment, as if caught in behavior that didn't match his practical image. "Walt Whitman," he admitted, holding up the volume so she could see its worn cover and dog-eared pages. "My wife introduced me to his poetry during our courtship. I still read him sometimes, especially when the house feels too quiet." The admission revealed new depths to his character that Lily found unexpectedly moving. This strong man who faced down armed gunmen while finding solace in verse that spoke of beauty and human connection. The contrast between his public competence and private sensitivity created an emotional complexity that drew her despite every rational reason to maintain protective distance. "May I hear some?" she asked, moving her chair closer to his position near the fire. Her father had appreciated poetry, but their shared reading had focused on classical works and moral improvement rather than the passionate celebrations of life and love that Whitman was famous for throughout literary circles. Jack's expression showed surprise at her request, but he opened the book to a marked page and began reading in his deep, measured voice that gave weight and dignity to words that might have seemed overly emotional from other speakers. The poem spoke of grass growing over battlefields, of death and renewal, of love that transcended physical existence to become part of the eternal fabric connecting all living things. As his voice filled the quiet room, Lily found herself drawn deeper into the web of attraction that had been building between them despite every effort to maintain appropriate boundaries. The combination of his masculine presence and the tender vulnerability revealed through his choice of reading material created an emotional intimacy she'd never experienced with any man. "That's beautiful," she said softly when he finished the passage, her voice carrying genuine appreciation for both the poetry and his willingness to share something so personal. "Your wife had excellent taste in literature as well as husbands." Jack's expression grew distant as memories of his marriage surfaced, bringing with them the familiar weight of loss that had shadowed his life for 4 years. "She believed poetry could heal things that medicine couldn't touch," he said quietly, closing the book and setting it aside. "Used to read to me when I came back from scouting missions, helping me remember there was beauty in the world despite all the violence I'd witnessed." The pain in his voice touched something deep in Lily's chest, a recognition of shared loss that transcended the different circumstances of their grief. She'd watched her father die slowly from poison while being powerless to save him, carrying guilt and rage that had driven her across 3 territories in search of justice that might ease the ache in her heart.
I understand that feeling, she said, her voice barely audible above the gentle rain against the windows. After my father died, I couldn't bear to enter his library or touch his books. Everything reminded me of conversations we'd never have again, of all the things I should have told him while there was still time. Jack turned to study her face in the firelight, noting the tears that had gathered in her green eyes despite her efforts to maintain composure. The vulnerability she revealed in that moment created a bridge between them that transcended mere physical attraction or shared danger, touching the deeper places where grief and hope resided in careful balance. "What would you tell him now?" Jack asked gently, his voice carrying no pressure or expectation, merely an invitation to share whatever burden she might be carrying. Sometimes speaking the words aloud helps, even when the person who needs to hear them isn't there to listen. Lily's control finally broke as months of suppressed emotion flooded through the barriers she'd maintained since fleeing Seattle. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she spoke words that had been trapped inside her heart, waiting for someone safe enough to receive them without judgment or exploitation. "That I forgive him for keeping me so sheltered and protected that I never learned how to live in the real world," she said through her tears. "That I understand he was trying to keep me safe from men like Thomas Whitfield, but his protection left me ignorant about so many things that other women my age take for granted." Jack moved his chair closer to hers, offering the comfort of proximity without presuming to touch her while she worked through emotions that had clearly been building for months. His presence felt solid and reassuring, creating a safe space for revelations that might have seemed impossible under other circumstances. "What kind of things?" he asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already suspected the direction her confession was heading. His own experience with grief had taught him that healing often required speaking truths that felt dangerous or shameful, giving voice to fears and inadequacies that thrived in silence. Lily's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she prepared to voice the admission that had haunted her throughout her sheltered upbringing and aborted engagement to Marcus Hawthorne. The wine Jack had served with dinner had loosened her tongue slightly, but it was trust more than alcohol that enabled her to speak the words that had never passed her lips before. "I'm 30 years old," she whispered, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her clearly, "and I've never been intimate with a man. Never been kissed properly, never been courted by someone who wanted me rather than my father's approval and money. I don't know anything about the physical side of marriage or what happens between men and women when they love each other." The confession hung in the air between them like a confession seeking absolution, vulnerable and honest in ways that left her feeling exposed and defenseless. Years of careful social conditioning had taught her that such admissions represented scandalous failures of feminine development, marks of inadequacy that proper ladies never acknowledged even to themselves. Jack's response came without hesitation or judgment, his voice carrying the same steady acceptance that had characterized all their interactions since the morning they'd met. "Lily," he said, using her name with new gentleness, "there's nothing shameful about innocence, especially when it comes from being protected by someone who loved you enough to put your safety above social expectations." His words began dissolving the shame she'd carried for years, replacing self-criticism with a perspective that reframed her father's overprotection as love rather than failure. The relief of being understood rather than pitied created new emotional intimacy between them, deepening their connection beyond mere attraction into something that felt potentially transformative. "But I feel so foolish and unprepared," she continued, her tears slowing as his acceptance allowed her to speak more freely about fears that had plagued her since adolescence. "Other women my age have experience with men, with relationships, with all the things that make them confident and desirable. I don't know how to flirt or tease or make a man want me the way wives are supposed to please their husbands." Jack's expression grew thoughtful as he absorbed the full scope of her innocence, recognizing that her sheltered upbringing had left gaps in her education that extended far beyond simple physical experience. The social skills that most women developed through normal courtship and interaction had been denied to her by a father whose protective instincts had inadvertently created isolation rather than preparation for adult relationships. "Lily," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood the delicate nature of the territory they were exploring. A woman's worth isn't measured by her experience with men or her knowledge of physical intimacy. The right man will value your innocence as a gift rather than seeing it as inadequacy or failure. The gentle correction of her self-perception created new possibilities in her mind, allowing her to imagine scenarios where her inexperience might be cherished rather than criticized. The idea that innocence could be desirable rather than shameful represented a fundamental shift in understanding that opened doors she'd assumed were permanently closed. "Have you ever wanted to learn?" Jack asked quietly. His voice carrying undertones that suggested the question held personal significance beyond mere curiosity. About intimacy, about what happens between a man and woman who care for each other. Lily's heart accelerated as she recognized the invitation implicit in his question, the possibility that her education and physical love might not require waiting for some theoretical future husband who might never materialize. Jack Thompson represented everything she'd been taught to value in a man, combined with demonstrated kindness and patience that suggested he might be willing to guide her through discoveries she'd never dared hope to make. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she took the first step toward admitting desires she'd never acknowledged even to herself. "But I'm afraid of disappointing someone, of not knowing how to please a man or respond the way women are supposed to respond when they're being loved." Jack rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, bringing their faces level so she could see the sincerity and warmth in his blue eyes. His proximity sent heat through her body that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth, awakening sensations she'd only experienced in dreams and forbidden fantasies. "Lily," he said, his voice rough with emotion that matched the intensity building between them, "there's no right or wrong way to respond when someone touches you with love and respect. The only requirement is honesty about what you're feeling and what you want to experience." His hand rose slowly to cup her cheek, giving her every opportunity to pull away if his touch felt unwelcome or frightening. When she instead leaned into his palm, he smiled with tenderness that made her heart ache with longing for everything she'd never been allowed to discover about love and physical connection. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone with gentle pressure that sent shivers through her entire body. "Just a kiss, nothing more than you're ready for. We have all the time in the world to discover what you like and what makes you feel cherished." Instead of answering with words, Lily closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his with clumsy eagerness that revealed her complete inexperience while conveying the depth of her desire to learn. The kiss was soft and experimental at first, Jack's patience allowing her to set the pace while his experience guided their movements into rhythms that built slowly from tentative exploration to growing passion. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard, and Lily's face glowed with wonder at sensations she'd never imagined could be so overwhelming and beautiful simultaneously. The simple contact had awakened hungers in her body that demanded satisfaction while her inexperience left her uncertain about how to communicate those needs. "That was my first real kiss," she admitted, her voice filled with amazement at what she'd just discovered about herself and her capacity for physical pleasure. "I never knew it could feel like that, like every nerve in my body was suddenly alive and singing." Jack's smile held masculine satisfaction at her response but also tenderness that spoke of genuine caring rather than mere conquest or ego gratification. His own arousal was evident, but he made no move to press for more intimate contact, allowing her to process the new sensations without feeling pressured to progress beyond her comfort level. "There's so much more to learn," he said softly, his voice carrying promise that sent fresh heat through her body while his restraint reassured her that education would proceed at whatever pace felt safe and natural. "But we have time, Lily. All the time you need to discover what brings you pleasure and how beautiful you are when you let yourself feel everything your body was created to experience." Part 7, The Motivation Reveal. The next morning dawned clear and cold with frost decorating the windows and steam rising from the coffee Jack prepared while Lily emerged from her room feeling transformed by the previous evening's revelations and discoveries. The kiss they'd shared had awakened longings in her body that sleep hadn't diminished, leaving her acutely aware of Jack's presence and the new intimacy that existed between them. Their eyes met across the kitchen with mutual recognition of the emotional territory they'd entered, the careful boundaries that had been crossed and the possibilities that lay ahead if they chose to continue exploring the attraction that had been building since their first meeting. Jack's expression held warmth and desire tempered by patience, making clear that decisions about their future intimacy would remain entirely in her hands. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying new tenderness that sent shivers through her despite the warmth of the house. "Did you sleep well after our conversation?" Lily felt heat rise in her cheeks as memories of their kiss flooded back, along with dreams that had been far more explicit than anything her sheltered imagination had previously produced. The combination of awakened desire and continued innocence created internal tension that was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming in its intensity. "I dreamed," she admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered while their fingers brushed in contact that sent electricity up her arm. "About you, about us, about things I've never experienced but suddenly find myself wanting very much to understand." Jack's expression darkened with desire at her confession, though his self-control remained evident in the careful way he maintained physical distance while his eyes conveyed hunger that matched her own awakening needs. The restraint he showed despite obvious arousal demonstrated the patience and consideration that made him so different from other men in her limited experience. Before their conversation could develop further, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the intimate moment, sending both of them to the window where they saw a single rider approaching from the direction of Copper Ridge. Jack's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, though the visitor's casual pace suggested friendly rather than threatening intentions. The rider proved to be Deputy Marshal Collins from the Territorial Office, a weathered man in his 50s, whose reputation for honesty and competence had made him one of the few law enforcement officials in Montana Territory who couldn't be bought by interests like Thomas Whitfield's business empire. His arrival created both hope and anxiety, as official involvement might provide protection while also attracting unwanted attention to their situation. "Morning, Thompson," Collins called out as he dismounted near the porch, his sharp eyes taking in the defensive preparations that were subtly evident around the ranch house. "Heard you might have had some visitors recently, the kind that ask a lot of questions about travelers and wave around papers that might not be entirely legitimate." Jack stepped onto the porch to greet the deputy marshal, his posture relaxed but alert as he evaluated this new development in their increasingly complex circumstances. "Morning, Sam," he replied, using the familiarity that came from years of mutual respect and occasional cooperation during cattle rustling investigations. "What brings you out this way so early in the day?" Collins studied Jack's face with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading people's truthfulness and hidden motivations. "Got a telegram from Judge Morrison in Helena yesterday," he explained, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. "Seems there's been some questions raised about warrants being issued in Seattle for crimes that might not have actually been committed by the people named in those documents." Lily appeared in the doorway as Collins spoke, her presence immediately drawing the deputy marshal's attention to her auburn hair and obvious Eastern refinement that matched descriptions he'd undoubtedly received through official channels. His expression showed recognition mixed with professional curiosity as he assessed her potential role in whatever legal complications had brought him to Pine Valley. "Miss Morgan," Collins said, touching his hat brim in respectful greeting while his eyes evaluated her with lawman's thoroughness. "I believe you might be the young lady mentioned in some correspondence I've received from territorial authorities regarding irregularities in certain legal proceedings initiated in Washington Territory." Lily's heart accelerated as she recognized both opportunity and danger in the deputy marshal's arrival, understanding that official protection might be available while also realizing that any mistakes in handling this encounter could result in her being turned over to Whitfield's men through legal channels rather than violence. "Deputy Marshal Collins," she said carefully, stepping fully onto the porch despite the cold morning air, "I'm grateful for your interest in my situation, but I'm not certain what irregularities you might be referring to or how they relate to my current circumstances." Collins smiled slightly at her careful response, clearly appreciating both her intelligence and her caution in dealing with law enforcement that might or might not be entirely trustworthy. Miss, he said, his tone becoming more formal as he entered official territory, Judge Morrison has been
investigating complaints about territorial warrants being issued based on evidence that appears to have been fabricated or purchased rather than gathered through legitimate investigative procedures. The revelation that her situation had attracted attention from honest authorities provided the first hope Lily had felt since fleeing Seattle, suggesting that Thomas Whitfield's influence might not extend as far as she'd feared. Judge Morrison's reputation for integrity was well known throughout the territories, and his involvement suggested serious official interest in the corruption she'd been carrying evidence to expose. What kind of complaints? Jack asked, his protective instincts clearly engaged as he evaluated potential benefits and risks of official involvement in Lily's case. His experience with territorial politics had taught him that honest officials were rare and valuable, but also that corruption had deep roots that made reformers dangerous to themselves and anyone associated with them. Collins consulted his notes before responding, his professional demeanor making clear that he took these irregularities seriously despite the remote location and apparently minor nature of the case. Complaints about warrants being issued for alleged embezzlement without specific evidence being presented to justifying magistrates, he explained, along with questions about whether the supposed crimes actually fall under territorial jurisdiction rather than federal authority. Lily exchanged glances with Jack as the implications of the deputy marshal's investigation became clear. Recognizing that official scrutiny of Whitfield's legal tactics might provide exactly the protection and legitimacy she needed to present her father's evidence through proper channels rather than remaining a fugitive from purchased justice. Deputy Collins, she said, making a decision that would either provide salvation or doom her to capture by Whitfield's operatives. I believe I may have information relevant to your investigation, but I need assurance that anything I share will be handled through proper legal channels rather than being forwarded to parties who might have conflicts of interest. The deputy marshal's expression showed increased attention as he recognized the significance of her offer. Understanding that potential witnesses in corruption cases required careful protection from the powerful interests they were prepared to testify against. Miss Morgan, he said formally, Judge Morrison has authorized me to offer official protection to witnesses who can provide evidence of illegal activities involving territorial contracts and federal funding programs. Jack stepped closer to Lily's side, his presence offering support while his expression made clear that any arrangements regarding her safety would require his approval and involvement. Deputy, he said, his voice carrying quiet authority, what specific protections are you talking about? And how do we know Miss Morgan won't end up dead in a ditch somewhere if she agrees to cooperate with your investigation? Collins nodded approvingly at Jack's protective instincts, recognizing the legitimacy of concerns about witness safety in cases involving powerful and ruthless adversaries. Mr. Thompson, he replied, Judge Morrison is prepared to take Miss Morgan into protective custody in Helena, where she'll be guarded by federal marshals while her testimony is taken and evidence is evaluated by authorities who can't be influenced by local political pressures. The offer represented everything Lily had hoped to achieve since fleeing Seattle, but it also meant leaving the safety and growing intimacy she'd found at Jack's ranch for an uncertain future in the territorial capital. The choice between personal desires and public duty created internal conflict that showed in her expression as she weighed options that seemed mutually exclusive. How long would she need to remain in protective custody? Jack asked, his question revealing personal interest that went beyond mere concern for a guest's welfare. His voice carried undertones that suggested her departure would leave an emptiness in his life that extended beyond simple loneliness or routine disruption. Depends on how complex the case proves to be, Collins admitted, his honesty creating both appreciation and anxiety about the commitment being requested. Could be weeks or months, especially if the evidence leads to multiple investigations involving different jurisdictions and levels of government authority. Lily studied Jack's face as she absorbed the implications of extended separation at the moment their relationship was beginning to develop beyond friendship into something that might have permanent significance in both their lives. The irony of finding love just as duty demanded sacrifice wasn't lost on her, and the pain in Jack's expression suggested he understood the difficult choice being presented. I need time to consider your offer, she said, finally, her voice carrying the weight of decision that could affect not just her own future but the lives of everyone who'd helped her reach this point of potential justice for her father's murder and the crimes that had motivated it. Collins nodded understanding while mounting his horse, clearly recognizing that such decisions couldn't be rushed without risking poor choices that might compromise both witness safety and investigation success. "I'll be staying in Copper Ridge for the next few days," he said, handing Jack a card with his hotel information. "Miss Morgan can reach me there when she's ready to discuss arrangements, but I'd advise not waiting too long. Men like Thomas Whitfield don't give up easily, and protective custody becomes more difficult to arrange if situations deteriorate further." Part 8. The parallel recognition. After the deputy marshal's departure, Jack and Lily found themselves facing questions that went beyond simple legal strategy into the fundamental nature of what was developing between them and whether it could survive the pressures of her situation. They worked through the morning routine in thoughtful silence, both processing the implications of official protection against the reality of separation that such safety would require. By afternoon, they'd settled into chairs near the fire where honest conversation could address the emotional complexities that legal solutions couldn't resolve. Jack's expression showed internal struggle as he balanced his desire to keep her close against recognition that her safety and justice for her father demanded cooperation with authorities who could provide protection. He couldn't offer a loan. "Lily," he said finally, his voice carrying the difficulty of someone preparing to make personal sacrifice for another's welfare, "you need to accept Deputy Collins' offer. Thomas Whitfield's resources are too extensive for one man to fight, even with help from hired hands and friendly neighbors. Official protection is your best chance of surviving long enough to see justice done." His words carried conviction that masked the personal cost such separation would exact from him, revealing the fundamental decency that put her needs ahead of his own desires despite the growing attraction between them. The selflessness of his position touched her more deeply than romantic declarations might have achieved, demonstrating love through sacrifice rather than possession. "What about us?" she asked softly, her voice carrying vulnerability that acknowledged how completely her feelings had become invested in their developing relationship. "What about what's beginning to happen between us? The possibilities we were starting to explore together?" Jack's expression showed pain that reflected her own as he confronted the reality that timing and circumstances seemed determined to prevent the happiness they might have found under different conditions. The cruel irony of finding someone worth loving at the moment duty demanded separation wasn't lost on either of them. "If what we're feeling is real, it'll survive whatever time and distance are required for you to complete this fight," he said, though his voice carried doubt that suggested uncertainty about whether such optimism was realistic or merely hopeful thinking designed to make separation bearable. Lily rose from her chair to move closer to his position by the fire, drawn by need for physical proximity that might ease the emotional turmoil created by their impossible situation. Her hand found his where it rested on the arm of his chair, fingers intertwining with familiar comfort that had developed despite the brief duration of their acquaintance. "Jack," she said, her voice carrying new resolve as she reached a decision about priorities and possibilities. "I don't want to leave here without understanding what we might mean to each other. I don't want to spend weeks or months in protective custody wondering about experiences I was too frightened or proper to explore when I had the chance." His blue eyes searched hers as he absorbed the implications of her statement, recognizing both invitation and urgency in her words that suggested she was prepared to accelerate their physical relationship beyond the careful progression he'd planned for her comfort and education. The desire in her expression matched his own, while her inexperience demanded gentleness that might be difficult to maintain given the emotional intensity of their situation. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with arousal that had been building since their first kiss, while his restraint demonstrated the consideration that made him different from men who might take advantage of her vulnerability and inexperience. "Because once we cross certain lines, there's no returning to the innocence you've preserved for 30 years. Instead of answering with words, Lily leaned forward to kiss him with growing confidence that reflected both desire and trust in his patient guidance of her sexual education. Her lips moved against his with passion that surprised them both, revealing depths of need that her sheltered upbringing had suppressed rather than eliminated entirely. When they separated,
Both were breathing hard, and Jack's control showed visible strain as he struggled between desire to claim her completely and responsibility to ensure her choices were made without pressure or coercion. The conflict between his own needs and his protective instincts created tension that added urgency to their physical attraction. "Show me," she whispered, her voice carrying the breathless quality of someone discovering new aspects of her own nature through awakened desire. "Show me what I've been missing, what it means to be loved by someone who cares about my pleasure as much as his own." Jack's resistance crumbled at her direct request, recognizing that her education in physical love was something she genuinely wanted rather than something she felt obligated to provide in exchange for his protection and kindness. The distinction mattered deeply to him, ensuring that whatever intimacy developed between them would be based on mutual desire rather than gratitude or circumstance. "Not here," he said, rising from his chair and offering his hand with gesture that conveyed both invitation and respect for her right to change her mind at any point in their progression toward greater intimacy. "My bedroom, where we can be comfortable and private while you discover what your body was created to experience." Lily accepted his hand without hesitation, allowing him to lead her toward the room where she'd spent the previous nights dreaming of exactly this possibility while believing it might remain forever fantasy rather than achievable reality. The transition from imagination to actuality filled her with excitement and nervousness in equal measure. In his bedroom, Jack lit candles rather than harsh lamplight, creating atmosphere that would enhance rather than expose the vulnerability inherent in her first intimate experience with a man. His consideration for her comfort extended to every detail, from the soft music created by wind in the eaves to the warmth he maintained by banking the fire before focusing entirely on her education and pleasure. "I don't know what to do," she admitted as they stood facing each other beside his bed, her confidence faltering slightly as reality replaced fantasy and inexperience created uncertainty about expectations and performance. The vulnerability in her voice touched his heart, while her honesty about limitations enabled him to provide exactly the guidance she needed. "You don't need to know anything except what feels good to you," Jack replied, his hands rising to frame her face with gentleness that conveyed reverence as much as desire. His touch was warm and steady, providing anchor points of connection that eased her nervousness while building anticipation for discoveries ahead. "Everything else is my responsibility," he continued, his voice carrying promise that her pleasure would be his primary concern throughout whatever intimacy they shared. "All you need to do is be honest about what you like and what you want more of, and trust me to take care of everything else." The combination of his patience and her growing desire created perfect conditions for the education she'd requested, allowing natural responses to guide their progression rather than forcing advancement beyond her emotional or physical readiness. Jack's experience enabled him to read her body's signals, while his caring ensured that every new sensation enhanced rather than overwhelmed her capacity for pleasure. Part 9. The Active Choice. The following morning brought news that changed everything about their situation and the choices they faced regarding her testimony and their future together. Deputy Marshal Collins returned with additional information from Judge Morrison that provided both hope and urgency, creating time pressure that would force decisions about priorities and possibilities they'd hoped to explore more gradually. "Miss Morgan," Collins announced without preamble, "Judge Morrison's investigation has uncovered evidence that Thomas Whitfield is planning to leave the country within the week, taking with him resources and connections that would make future prosecution nearly impossible. If you're going to testify, it needs to happen immediately rather than waiting for more convenient circumstances." Lily exchanged glances with Jack as the implications became clear, recognizing that delay would mean losing the opportunity for justice her father had died trying to achieve. The choice between personal happiness and public duty had become immediate rather than theoretical, demanding decision rather than continued contemplation. "What exactly would be required?" Jack asked, his protective instincts fully engaged as he evaluated risks and benefits of accelerated cooperation with authorities who might or might not be entirely trustworthy, despite their official credentials and apparently honest motivations. Collins consulted his notes before responding, his professional demeanor making clear that arrangements had already been made pending her agreement to participate in investigations that extended beyond Montana territory into federal jurisdiction. "We'd need to leave for Helena today," he explained, where Miss Morgan would provide detailed testimony about her father's evidence while federal marshals arrange for safe transportation to Seattle for recovery of the documents she's described. The timeline provided no opportunity for gradual adjustment to separation or careful planning of their personal relationships' continuation under difficult circumstances. Everything they'd hoped to explore and develop would need to be compressed into whatever time remained before duty demanded sacrifice of personal desires for larger principles of justice and protection. "I'll need to pack my things," Lily said, her voice carrying acceptance of necessity despite the pain visible in her expression as she contemplated leaving the safety and growing love she'd found at Jack's ranch. The decision was clearly difficult, but her resolve demonstrated the courage that had enabled her to flee Seattle and survive 3 weeks of pursuit by determined killers. Jack's face showed the internal struggle between his desire to convince her to stay and his recognition that her safety and her father's justice required cooperation with authorities who could provide protection and legitimacy he couldn't offer alone. The conflict between personal needs and moral obligations created visible tension that affected them both. "Lily," he said quietly, moving closer to offer physical support while she processed the emotional impact of sudden separation, "you're making the right choice even though it's the hardest choice. Your father's evidence could prevent other families from suffering what you've endured, and that matters more than what we might lose by waiting to explore what's developing between us." His words provided the encouragement she needed while demonstrating once again the fundamental decency that had drawn her to him from their first meeting. Jack Thompson's ability to put principle ahead of personal desire proved his worthiness of the love she was discovering for him, even as circumstances conspired to separate them at the crucial moment. "What if I never see you again?" she asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her since Colin's arrival with his urgent timeline and uncertain promises about future safety. "What if testifying against Whitfield makes me a permanent target who can never return to the life and love I've found here?" Jack's expression showed pain that matched her own as he confronted possibilities neither wanted to acknowledge but both understood were realistic given the stakes involved in challenging someone with Thomas Whitfield's resources and ruthless determination to protect his empire regardless of human cost. "Then we'll have had these few days together, and that's more than most people ever find," he replied, his voice carrying forced optimism that masked deeper fears about separation and uncertainty. "But I believe you'll come back, Lily. I believe justice will prevail, and you'll be free to choose your own future once Whitfield's power is broken and his crimes are exposed." The conversation was interrupted by sounds of rapid hoofbeats approaching from multiple directions, causing both Jack and Collins to reach for weapons while Lily's heart sank with recognition that their time for decision-making had expired. Through the windows they could see at least 6 riders surrounding the ranch house, their positions and weapons suggesting this was the coordinated assault they'd been expecting since Miller's first appearance. Thomas Whitfield himself sat his horse at the head of the group, his presence indicating that he'd decided to handle Lily's capture personally, rather than trusting subordinates who'd failed to complete their mission through previous attempts. His cold smile and expensive clothing created stark contrast with the harsh landscape and desperate situation developing around the ranch house. "It seems our timeline has been accelerated even further," Collins observed grimly, checking his weapons while assessing their defensive position against superior numbers of attackers who'd chosen their moment to strike when official protection was present but not yet effective in removing their target from reach. Jack's expression hardened into lines of determined resistance as he prepared to defend both Lily and the deputy marshal against odds that strongly favored their attackers. His experience and training would be crucial in the battle that was clearly inevitable, regardless of attempts at negotiation or surrender that Whitfield was unlikely to accept given the stakes involved. "Stay low and stay together," he instructed, positioning himself near a window that offered good fields of fire while providing some protection from return shots that would certainly follow any resistance they offered to Whitfield's demands for Lily's surrender. Thomas Whitfield's voice carried clearly across the ranch yard as he prepared to deliver whatever ultimatum he'd traveled so far to present, his tone holding the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through combinations of wealth, political influence, and carefully applied violence when other methods proved insufficient. The final confrontation had arrived, and everything they'd worked toward would be decided in the next few minutes through either successful defense of their position or capture that would end both Lily's quest for justice and any hope for the future she'd begun to envision with Jack Thompson in the Montana wilderness. They'd both come to love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.